Well, the first thing you have to know about, and you could just say this of, I think, the black community in general, or you could say this of cities in general, and we're talking about the early '80s up until the early '90s, so roughly about a decade period. The thing is, we were coming out of the civil rights movement, where there was great optimism, a great sense that we had made this step forward. We were now fully integrated into this country, at least legally, and there would be a smooth ride from that point forward. We also had a perception that all of, or the great majority of our challenges were not just external, but they were visible, they were tangible, they were Bull Connor, they were fire hoses, they were whites only signs. There were people, throughout the 60s and throughout the 70s who tried to deal with things that were less seen. But the dominant line of critique was a highly visual, a highly charged, a highly visceral sort of representation of what racism was, the problems that afflicted African Americans. When you think about the civil rights movement, you think about Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, John F. Kennedy shot. You think about kids fire hosed. That shaped our perception moving forward. We were not prepared for what hit us. To end up in a situation from an African American perspective where crack comes to a city like Baltimore, where HIV comes to a city like Baltimore, where heroin is still a problem in a city like Baltimore, where work is disappearing as it was across the country for black working class, white working class people, for all of those things to come at one time and to not be able to put a particular face on what you were dealing with, when oftentimes the face that you would put on it looked just like you, led to a sense of widespread panic. We were afraid. We were extremely, extremely afraid. I am talking as someone who has gone back and researched that period and talked to people from that period. As a child, I had no knowledge of what was going on. I knew that people were panicked. I knew that there were certain articles of clothing that you were no longer allowed to wear. Not that my parents would have been into that anyway. My dad was of a different mindset, let's just say. But there were certain ways that you had to walk through the streets. There were certain codes you had to obey. I was not a kid who was born for that particular moment. It was something that I had to come to. I always sort of chuckle when people talk about Barack Obama and him coming to his understanding of what it means to be black in an inorganic fashion, in a very learned fashion. And I always think about how, for so many of us in the community, we had to learn too. It's always changing. And so what it was to be black in Baltimore in 1988, 1989, was not what it was to be black in Baltimore in 1969 or 1959. Your parents can tell you a little bit, but it's a new environment. And as kids coming of age, moving into early manhood, we had to figure it out. And it was just a terrifying time. I mean, you're talking about murder rates that people don't understand even today. People are still debating over why the murder rate kicked up like it did. You're talking about the grand media hysteria around crack. And yet, I have a certain romance for that period. I think about all the great music that was coming out back then, Public Enemy, Rakim, later people like Nas. I think about that was the era of Michael Jordan, and every kid wanted to be Michael Jordan. And I think about him in the dunk contests and that sort of thing. Perhaps I'm one of the few black people who will say this, but that was the high of the era of Dungeons and Dragons, and I was a huge Dungeons and Dragons guy. And I can think back to laying out on the attic floor with my older brother Malik and just sort of whiling time away like that. I think about the Commodore 64, which is the touch point in so many kids' lives who came up in that period. Comic books. I see all these comic book movies now, and I think, man, it just ain't like it was when I was a kid. So it's all of that together. You could probably make a grand critique of the country at large and say after the 60s, people were just trying to figure out who they were. Um, and that goes for us too, I think. I have trouble seeing myself living in a suburban environment. I have less trouble seeing myself living in a rural environment. I'm of extremes. Either there's going to be a lot of people or there's going to be nobody. Um, I think I get great energy just walking in a city like New York, walking through the streets. When I first came here, I lived in Brooklyn, very urban environment. I was a young, struggling writer. Um, and I can remember catching a train into Manhattan and walking through the streets and thinking, wow, I want to be part of this. And then going back and feeling like, well, I have to do something that makes me part of this conversation. New York, it just, coming in contact with all these different sorts of people, it's a catalyst. Writers, I think, and probably artists in general, they feed off of information and different sorts of information. So some of that is just sitting back with as many books as possible, okay? Another part of that is seeing as many movies as possible. But the greater part of that is seeing people interact with each other and being constantly shocked and surprised by what people create and how they interact with each other. New York is that on steroids. It's like times 20. So while that's true in any city, it's especially true here. I have difficulty thinking about how I would create art without that. I mean, I would try to figure it out, but certainly that helps. It really does.